In early November 2025, the people of the Philippines found themselves bracing once again for the arrival of a massive tropical cyclone, one that meteorologists would later call among the most powerful to hit the country in recent years. Super Typhoon Fung-Wong, known locally as Uwan, formed over the warm waters of the western Pacific and gained strength with alarming speed. Within a matter of days, the storm's winds intensified from a tropical depression into a full-blown super typhoon, packing sustained speeds of around 185 kilometers per hour and gusts reaching 230. The Philippine Atmospheric, Geophysical and Astronomical Services Administration, PAGASA, issued the highest possible storm signal over several provinces in Luzon, warning of life-threatening winds, torrential rain, and storm surges that could reach up to 5 meters. As the storm approached the country's eastern seaboard, memories of past disasters resurfaced for many Filipinos. The images of flattened villages and flooded streets from Typhoon Haiyan in 2013 and, more recently, Typhoon Kamiji just a week earlier, were still vivid. The Philippines, lying directly in the path of the Pacific's typhoon belt, experiences around 20 major storms each year, but each new one seems to test the nation's resilience in different and more difficult ways. Officials warned that the danger was especially acute this time because the soil was already saturated from previous rains. Flooding and landslides were almost certain. In Catanduanes, one of the first provinces expected to face the brunt of Fung-Wong, the winds began to howl before dawn on November 9th, tearing at rooftops and bending trees to the ground. Power lines snapped one after another, and by mid-morning, much of the island was in darkness. Across the Bicol region, hundreds of families huddled in evacuation centers, school buildings, churches, and gymnasiums converted into temporary shelters. Many carried only a few belongings, blankets, and food packs distributed by local officials. The government had ordered mass evacuations in advance, and by the time the typhoon made landfall, more than 100,000 people had been relocated from high-risk coastal and low-lying areas. Despite these precautions, the storm's ferocity left its mark almost immediately. Roofs were peeled from homes like tin sheets, trees were uprooted, and roads were blocked by landslides. Emergency workers struggled to reach some areas because of flooding and fallen debris. Defense officials warned that rescue operations would become nearly impossible once the full force of the winds hit. In the capital, Manila, rain began to pour heavily in the afternoon. Though the city lay hundreds of kilometers from the typhoon's eye, it was not spared from the storm's wide rain bands, which stretched across much of Luzon. The metropolis, home to more than 13 million people, prepared for widespread flooding as rivers swelled and drainage systems overflowed. Local governments raised alerts, and residents in flood-prone neighborhoods were advised to move to higher ground. Flights were canceled at Ninoy Aquino International Airport, ports were shut, and ferry operations across the country were suspended. The transportation system ground to a halt, leaving thousands stranded. By the evening of November 9th, the typhoon had made its first landfall along the eastern coast of Luzon, near the border of Isabela and Aurora provinces. Meteorologists described the storm as unusually large, with an estimated diameter of up to 1,500 kilometers. Within this vast circulation, torrential rains battered the northern and central regions of the country. In the mountains of the Cordillera region, villagers reported flash floods and mudslides. Several communities became isolated as roads and bridges collapsed under the weight of swollen rivers. 2 fatalities were confirmed in the first hours after landfall, 1 person drowned in floodwaters, and another was trapped under debris when a wall collapsed. Authorities feared that the toll would rise once communication was restored to cut-off areas. Throughout the night, the wind roared like a jet engine, rattling windows and shaking buildings. In the province of Quezon, families gathered in candlelight inside makeshift shelters, listening to radio updates on battery-powered sets. One evacuee, a 65-year-old man named Apollo, sat beside his wife in a crowded school gymnasium that had been turned into an evacuation center. They had left their home near a creek after floodwaters began to rise in the early afternoon. Their small house, made of wood and corrugated metal, had already flooded several times in the past years. "You never get used to it," his wife said softly. Every storm feels like the first time. By dawn on November 10th, Fung-Wong had crossed northern Luzon and began to weaken slightly as it moved over land, but it remained a powerful and dangerous system. The damage was extensive. Entire villages were submerged, and vast tracts of farmland were destroyed. Rice paddies lay under brown water, their young plants flattened by the wind. Farmers worried about their harvests, knowing that the losses would ripple through the food supply in the weeks ahead. For a country where agriculture remains a vital part of the economy, the destruction of crops and livestock meant not just immediate hardship but long-term economic pain. Power outages spread across more than a dozen provinces. Transmission lines were down, and utility crews were unable to begin repairs because of continuing heavy rain. Communication networks were patchy at best. In some regions, only satellite phones provided any link to the outside world. Government officials convened emergency meetings to coordinate the response. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. declared a state of emergency, allowing for the rapid mobilization of national and local resources. The Department of Social Welfare and Development began distributing relief goods, rice, canned food, bottled water, and blankets, to the worst-hit areas, while the military deployed trucks and helicopters for rescue missions. In many towns, local mayors took charge of rescue efforts with little more than their own vehicles and volunteers. In the coastal community of Baggao, soldiers waded through waist-deep water to pull elderly residents from their flooded homes. Elsewhere, fishermen secured their boats far inland, tethering them to trees in the hope that they would not be swept away. In one harrowing scene reported by local media, a group of volunteers formed a human chain to rescue children trapped on the roof of a house as water levels rose. The economic toll began to mount even before the storm had fully passed. The Department of Agriculture estimated that initial damage to crops and fisheries could exceed billions of pesos. Supply chains were disrupted as roads and bridges remained impassable. Trucks carrying food and relief supplies were stuck in mud or blocked by fallen trees. Fuel deliveries were delayed, and electricity shortages affected water supply systems. The private sector, including telecommunications and logistics companies, worked with the government to restore essential services. Airlines faced days of cancellations, while ports reported stranded cargo ships unable to dock because of rough seas. Beyond the physical damage, the psychological toll of yet another super typhoon weighed heavily on communities already fatigued by constant disasters. In interviews broadcast by national television, evacuees expressed both gratitude for surviving and anxiety about rebuilding. Many said they no longer had the resources to repair their homes or restart their small businesses. Local leaders called for more investment in permanent evacuation shelters and resilient infrastructure. Experts from the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology warned that the heavy rains could trigger lahar flows around Mount Mayang, where volcanic debris could mix with floodwaters to create deadly mudslides. As the typhoon exited the western coast of Luzon and moved toward the South China Sea, meteorologists warned that it could still re-intensify over warm waters, possibly affecting Taiwan in the following days. For the Philippines, however, the worst was over, though the aftermath promised to be long and difficult. Satellite images showed vast areas of northern Luzon underwater. The city of Tuguegarao, usually bustling with activity, appeared quiet and deserted, its streets turned into rivers. In the province of Ilocos Norte, waves as high as 3 meters pounded the shoreline, destroying seawalls and washing away fishing equipment. The challenge of recovery loomed large. The National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council coordinated damage assessments with local governments, but access remained difficult. Helicopters surveyed the devastation from above, spotting clusters of houses reduced to rubble and fields that looked like muddy lakes. Humanitarian agencies began mobilizing, but the government initially declined large-scale foreign aid, saying it wanted to assess domestic capacity first. Offers of help came from neighboring countries, including Japan and the United States, both of which have long supported the Philippines in disaster response. Scientists observing the storm noted that its rapid intensification was consistent with a troubling trend. As global sea temperatures rise, typhoons in the Pacific are gaining strength more quickly, leaving less time for communities to prepare. The case of Fung-Wong, which grew from a tropical storm into a super typhoon in less than 48 hours, was a stark example of this phenomenon. Climate researchers pointed out that the Philippines' geographic position makes it particularly exposed to such storms, and that adaptation measures, stronger housing, improved drainage, and early warning systems are increasingly urgent. The government's handling of the crisis drew both praise and criticism. Observers acknowledged that preemptive evacuations had saved many lives, but some local officials complained that national aid was slow to arrive. In remote areas, residents waited days for food and clean water. Others said that the lessons of previous storms had not been fully learned. Too many homes remained in flood-prone zones, and rebuilding efforts often replicated the same vulnerabilities. Environmental groups renewed calls for stricter land use planning and reforestation to reduce landslide risks. For many Filipinos, however, survival itself was a testament to resilience. In the days following the storm, stories of solidarity and small acts of kindness emerged. In a village near Legazpi City, a group of teachers turned their damaged school into a community kitchen, cooking rice and soup for evacuees using whatever supplies remained. In another town, teenagers helped clear fallen trees from the roads, while priests opened church doors to families who had lost their homes. Across social media, messages of hope and determination spread. Bangon Pilipinas, Rise, Philippines, became a rallying cry. As relief operations continued, the full scale of the disaster slowly came into view. Initial assessments suggested that more than 1 million people had been displaced. Thousands of houses were damaged or destroyed, particularly in the Baikal and Cagayan Valley regions. Waterborne diseases became a concern as sanitation systems failed. Hospitals reported a surge of patients with injuries, infections, and respiratory illnesses. Aid agencies distributed hygiene kits alongside food and water to prevent outbreaks. The international community followed the developments closely. News outlets around the world showed images of flooded towns, shattered houses, and evacuees trudging through knee-deep water. Global humanitarian organizations prepared to send assistance, even as domestic relief efforts intensified. Economists predicted that the financial cost could reach several $100 million, a significant burden for a country already grappling with inflation and recovery from earlier disasters. By mid-November, the skies over Luzon began to clear, but the landscape bore the scars of the storm. The once green fields had turned to brown expanses of mud. In coastal areas, seawater had contaminated wells, making clean drinking water scarce. Schools used as evacuation centers remained closed, delaying the return of children to classes. Government engineers worked to restore power lines and repair bridges, but the effort would take weeks. The challenge was not only to rebuild but to rebuild better, to make communities more resilient against the next inevitable storm. As scientists and policymakers debated long-term climate adaptation, many ordinary Filipinos returned to the routines of recovery, patching roofs, cleaning debris, salvaging what remained of their belongings. For them, life after Fung-Wong was a mixture of exhaustion and quiet determination. Each storm, they said, taught them something new about survival, yet also reminded them of their vulnerability. The Philippines' location along the typhoon corridor ensures that storms will always be part of its story, but for those who endure them, the goal is not merely to survive the next one, but to build a future in which survival does not come at such a heavy cost. By the end of the month, power had been restored to most affected areas, though some remote villages remained without electricity. Relief agencies transitioned from emergency aid to recovery programs, helping farmers replant crops and small businesses restart operations. The government promised new funding for flood control and housing projects, acknowledging that climate resilience must become a national priority. For many, however, rebuilding was a slow process. Families who had lost their homes continued to live in temporary shelters. Some decided to relocate permanently, unwilling to face another year of storms. In the aftermath, meteorologists reflected on the lessons of Fung-Wong. It had been a textbook example of rapid intensification and wide-ranging impact. Its enormous size meant that even areas far from the center experienced destructive winds and rain. The storm had exposed weaknesses in infrastructure but also demonstrated the effectiveness of early warnings and coordinated evacuations. In many ways, it represented both the progress and the persistent challenges of disaster management in the Philippines. As December approached, life slowly returned to a fragile normal. Markets reopened, buses ran again, and children played in streets still damp from receding floodwaters. Yet the memory of the storm lingered. For those who had lived through it, the sound of howling wind at night would remain etched in their minds. They knew that in this corner of the Pacific, peace between storms is only temporary. Each calm sunrise is a reminder that resilience, like the land itself, must be rebuilt again and again.